Hello, and welcome to this session on Introduction to Employee Ownership. My name is Jenny Loper, and I'll be your moderator today. I am the Director of Operations at Zebulon Solutions. We are an end-to-end product development firm that work with small and medium-sized companies and helping them take their ideas from concept all the way through manufacturing. My specific experience is related to operational consulting and supplier quality, as well as helping customers find that contract manufacturer for their product. I'm joined with Ashley Ortiz. She is an entrepreneurial business support specialist with more than 15 years of experience. She has a passion for equitable economy and is the technical assistant specialist at the Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center. Previously worked for the Bay Area's Arizmendi Association. So Ashley, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. As we get into this, I think I will hand this over to you and let you talk through the first couple slides, and then I'll interrupt you again.
Great, thank you. So yes, great to be here. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Before I do dive in, I just wanted to ask a question to anyone out there who's listening to see if you might be willing to put into the chat box any information about whether you're here today because you're thinking about starting up an employee-owned business as a startup. It'd be really helpful to know if anyone here today is here looking for that information. So I will dive into a little bit of information, and Jenny will compile that information, and we'll report back in a little bit. So a little bit about the Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center, where I work. Our main mission is to build a more just and sustainable economy through employee ownership, and we do that by supporting businesses through technical assistance, helping businesses convert to employee ownership or support them through startup of these types of models. We also provide education on employee ownership, on different models, benefits of those businesses, and best practices. And then we also work to create connections between employee-owned businesses to help strengthen the whole sector. And a little bit about me, Jenny gave a great background, just a little bit more. I started focusing on worker-owned cooperatives, a specific kind of employee-owned business in grad school, and ended up focusing my thesis on supporting worker-owned businesses in Los Angeles, and then ended up working for the Arizmendi Association of Cooperatives in the Bay Area, which is a network of 9 worker-owned businesses. And I did support work behind the scenes, so to speak, for all of those businesses. Was also a working owner of one of the bakeries of that network, and then moved to work with the Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center last year. So really quick, I'll just pause for a second and see if we got any feedback.
No, I don't think we have any feedback, but if you are online and able to engage with us, go ahead and click on that Q&A button. I think you have to ask the question, but you can just put in your answers in there, not as real questions, and that's fine. The question that I guess I will ask, if you want to go ahead and try and answer this in the Q&A, is what interest brought you here to listen to an intro about employee ownership? So I think with that, we'll see if anyone answers on that.
Great, and I'll keep going. So I just wanted to start with a really quick overview. What is employee ownership? At its simplest level, it's a proven business concept which has really been around back to the mid-1800s. And it just means that a broad base of the staff members who work in a specific business own a financial share in the company where they work. And I wanted to place today's talk a little bit in the current crisis that I know all of us in the business world have been going through, not only with the pandemic, but also you might have heard of a movement within the business community now that a lot of people are calling the Silver Tsunami, which is that many, many baby boomers are retiring, and lots of those businesses are at risk of closure because they're not finding buyers and there's no one to transfer those businesses to. And as we know, when that happens, local jobs are lost. And then just overall, right now in our economy, many working people are not economically secure. As I mentioned, the pandemic has made that worse. There's long-term unemployment happening at really high levels. Many companies are switching roles to contract positions because of crunches in finances, and BIPOC businesses, workers, and communities have been disproportionately affected by these challenges. So within this, we feel like there's a great potential of employee ownership. And we've seen this historically happen in several iterations. Most recently, after the 2008 crash, the number of worker co-ops, which is one type of employee ownership, actually doubled in the US. And that's because oftentimes, in times of crises and in challenges, people look to come together often to find something new, and to explore all the options they can before they shut down a business or decide whether or not to start one. And one of the great potentials too of employee ownership is that you do get to share the benefits in good times, but also the burdens in hard times, but at least you're doing that collectively with more people. So I'll stop for one more second and check in.
Sure. We did get one question from Dan, or comment from Dan, about he's interested in EO business in the tech space and is curious if there's anyone doing this, because he hasn't come across anybody in the tech space doing an EO. So there's that. One thing that I will say to our audience that like I said, we will pause kind of at the end of each section. So if you do have questions, go ahead and type them in, and I will interrupt Ashley and ask her. So I think I'll let you talk about the tech space or your next comments.
Great, thanks. Yeah, there is a lot happening, and I'm not going to touch too much on it today, but the direction I would recommend looking is called platform cooperatives for tech startups. It's a way that the cooperative model and the employee ownership concept is being manifested in a digital way and across large platforms. One resource you could also look to is called start.coop. Start.coop is actually an incubator for cooperative businesses that is being modeled very closely after a lot of the venture startups around tech. So just a little note about that. We can definitely talk more about that at the end. So one great thing in the context of the challenging climate that we're in for business is that you can make a difference simply by becoming employee-owned. It allows you to become more resilient in times of economic downturn. There's solutions within these models that have been time-tested over multiple iterations of businesses and the different waves that have gone through the economies. And it's a really great way to help revitalize not only the local economy where the business is, but also the larger economy that the workers and the owners are contributing to. So some benefits for the EO for your company. These 6 I'm going to dive into in a little bit more detail here as we go along. So creating a stronger, more resilient company. As you can imagine, if the workers who are there within a company actually own the firm, the company tends to perform substantially better. And here are some statistics about that. The EO companies tend to have higher profit margins, faster growth per year, 25% more likely to stay in business than traditional companies. And worker co-ops, one of the types that I mentioned earlier, are way more likely to still be in business after 5 years compared to about 90% are still in business after about 20% of traditional companies. And this is often in cases where you see that businesses are not only sharing the financial piece of the company, but also engaging employees in participation of how to run that business. Also, having employees as a built-in buyer, if you are already in business and thinking about selling that business, around 80% of business owners actually don't find a buyer when they're hoping to do that. And right now we're seeing only about 15% transition within families. So selling to employees creates this natural buyer. It also creates consistency and jobs, local business stability. It can allow you to preserve your legacy, again, if you're already in business, and something that helps you tap into tax benefits for not only the company and the owners, but also the employees once they become owners as well. So taking care of your employees. This you can do from the start as a startup. You can do this by converting to employee ownership. And obviously this has implications that are positive throughout many iterations of being in business. EO companies tend to be able to pay higher wages, have better benefits, and employee owners in lots of cases have opportunities to participate in decision making, which can really sort of ripple out into all types of community spaces. People learning about democracy within their workplace can have a big impact on the community as a whole. I wanted to point out too, just a quick note about micro businesses. Some of the things we'll talk about today are about larger businesses or about converting them, but these models can work really well for small or micro businesses of just a couple people or even one, because businesses can come together in this way to either form new businesses, to work together to support compatible products or services. Or there's larger cooperative networks that can be formed where people can share benefits like marketing and supplies, working space, all sorts of things. So it's really something that's applicable to all sizes of business. And then just a quick note about the tax incentives. I won't go into too much detail today, but just know that no matter what path you go down, there are great benefits. An ESOP, one kind of employee ownership that I'll talk about, allows owners to avoid double taxation on corporate earnings and their percentage of ownership that's held by the ESOP. And then there's a Code 1042, which applies to the worker co-ops, another type of EO that has resulting favorable tax treatment. So there's lots of stuff to research on this front. So I'll just pause for a minute before we switch gears into the types of employee ownership and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, so please do put some questions. If you have questions, put them up and we'll cover them here. While I'm waiting for questions to be typed in, I guess one question for you is that when we're starting a business, what is something that one more time. I can't talk today. Goodness. All right. When starting a business, should I start as an EO company or change that into the structure after the business has grown?
Oh, that's a great question. Really, you can go down either path. And we're lucky in Colorado. There are tremendous resources here, all the way from the state government down to nonprofit sector resources, etc. So really, I would say look at this path no matter what direction you're going. There's great startup resources, whether it's in tech or any industry, and pathways to go down towards employee ownership. But also, again, if you have a business already, this is a great model for whatever type of transition you'd like to make, whether you want to leave the business, whether you just want to make that change and stay a part of it. And even if you don't start up as employee owned, learning a little bit about it, if it's something that intrigues you at the beginning, could help you make some decisions on the structure and the way that you set up that business that would allow you to transition into that kind of structure later down the road. So you really have a lot of options.
Just out of curiosity, how long does it take to transition into an EO business typically? And I realize there's probably a lot of assumptions that it's going to go into answering that question, but what would that timeline look like?
Yeah, it is, of course, super, super variable, but I'd say maybe on average, about a year would be the average time from the first time we either talk to an owner or an employee about the idea, kind of move through that process, bring in the specialty services that we need to help that transition, like legal services, typically CPAs, those sorts of folks. Once we get everybody on board and help both the selling owners and the employees get on board, figure out the new structure, say on average. Sometimes it's a lot longer though, and I definitely recommend, if you do already own a business and you're thinking about it, to start early. And it's fine to just start sort of the thoughts around that, especially if it's a succession planning type situation. Sometimes we'll work with businesses 10 years before somebody's wanting to transition out, and that's fantastic to have that much time to just kind of get everything in place and get the concepts and the workings of the business adapted to this new structure.
Is there any specific size or type of business that is best suited to employee ownership?
There's not. As you'll see, I'm going to jump into talking about different structures in a minute. They can apply to any type of business. As I mentioned, even micro businesses can pool together to create types of employee-owned models. Any business that's generally 3 or more can become a worker co-op. And then ESOPs we see up to, thousands of employee businesses. So there's something out there that should work. There's also employee-owned trusts, all sorts of models. Great. Well, I will switch gears here a little bit. This is a quick picture and quote from Namaste Solar, a really inspiring worker-owned cooperative in Colorado. And I'm going to talk about just the kind of 3 main types of employee ownership. Really 2 main ones, as I've already mentioned, both the worker-owned cooperative. There's also an employee stock ownership plan, which is called an ESOP. And then there's some other EO models or pathways, things like employee-owned trusts and basic stock and profit-sharing programs. And just a note here, a lot of companies do take gradual steps to full or broad-based employee ownership. So again, if you're small or just starting up, it's not something you have to do all at once. There's lots of ways to begin to share the ownership in terms of the financial aspect possibly, and then bring in more participation. So lots of ways that this can happen. And it does often happen in multiple iterations. So just a quick overview nationwide to give you a sense of the sector. There's around 600 worker cooperatives right now, and you can see just kind of a recent scattering of where they're clustered. And ESOPs, there's around 6,500 total across the country as well. Let's see here, these are different industries. I don't have all the details here, but to answer that question further, all of these represent different industries, the different colors. So you can see they're really all over the country. But now diving in just real quickly into these few structures. A worker-owned cooperative is actually a 100% employee-owned business, and it includes democratic values in the very structure of the business. In this case, the workers own the business and they share the profits. And decision-making within this business is democratic, meaning that one worker has one vote, and nobody can actually own more of the company to collectively then have a greater say than anyone else they work with. And this one really is appropriate for any size company. It's great for very small businesses, startups with just a few people. You can start from this form. The state of Colorado has tremendous resources. As I said earlier, the state is supporting this. We have actually 2 different types of structures within the statute of the state, which is not universal across the country right now. We're lucky to have it here. So you can actually start up as this type of business within that path towards starting up a new entity. And this is a pretty popular option for a lot of companies because it only costs around $10,000 to $15,000 to set up as a conversion. And so I just wanted to point that out. That would be for companies that are already in business. If you're thinking of starting it up from scratch, it really doesn't cost any more to actually go down that path from the very beginning than starting any other type of company. And just a quick overview of the governance to give you a view of what it looks like within the business. So co-ops are governed by a board of directors like another company that's elected by and comprised of a majority of those employee owners. So as I mentioned, one worker has one vote. They get to choose who represents them. In a lot of cooperatives, everybody actually serves on the board of directors. So there isn't even a split between who's running the board and the business itself. And management can look very traditional. There can be hierarchy within a cooperative, but essentially the structures are in place so that those management teams are answerable to that employee-owned board, which in the case of a co-op would often be a lot of the same people. So you start to see in this case, people are just wearing different hats. They're not only doing the work of the company, they might be on the board, and they might also be a shareholder of the company. And just a quick couple examples of co-ops in Colorado to point you in the direction of if you're interested. Fly Miata just actually was a conversion of a almost 40-year-old company last year where 9, or I think 8 in the end, worker owners ended up buying the business from the two original selling owners. Really great, inspiring story. Another one in Denver is an interior design company, fully woman-owned, and they are now an employee co-op. And just one more note here, back to the micro-owned business structure. As I mentioned, the cooperative structure can be a really great fit if you are starting up. It's very low cost, similar to other businesses. And it really has so much flexibility built into it for you to form your own entity and or then bring together other cooperatives or even other types of businesses to pool together. So definitely a great thing to research if that's where you're at right now. ESOPs are employee stock ownership plans. And basically in this type of format, the employees own shares of the company through a trust. So as opposed to the worker-owned co-op where they own the whole business, in this case, they're owning a portion of the company that's similar to a 401k retirement plan. So basically the company is making contributions into that plan, typically based on a percent of wages. And typically this is better for larger companies, around maybe 40 or 50 employees with larger revenues. It can work for smaller companies. There's always exceptions. So if it's of interest at a smaller scale, definitely still reach out, see if it might be a fit. There's great tax benefits, and the startup costs, or the conversion costs rather, for this tend to be anywhere from 50, even 75,000 or up. So that's why we typically see it working best with larger companies. And it is highly regulated, so it's requiring an annual valuation and the cost associated with that in an ongoing form. So you see really quickly, just in comparison here, in this case, the company actually sets up a board and a trustee represents the employees at that board level. And by law, employee owners have the right to vote on certain decisions. They can have additional voting rights in this case, but it's not necessary in an ESOP like it is in a cooperative. So you can have a participatory culture and management, but you can also have an ESOP trust and still run the business in a very similar way to how that business was set up originally. And a couple of quick examples here. Stone Age is a tool manufacturing company in the Durango area. And also in Arvada, we have a seed company that distributes seeds, and both really great examples, and also just to show how many different industries these businesses are in. And then, as I mentioned, there's a whole other realm of businesses that we often refer to sort of as the in-between. As I mentioned, you can go down these paths without taking a full leap into employee ownership by doing things like an employee-owned trust, stock sharing programs, and or different types of employee stock purchase plans. So there's ways to go forward if neither a worker co-op or an ESOP feels exactly right, but the general concept is interesting. Feel free to reach out to the resources I give at the end and see if something might be a good fit. Locally here in the area, in Fort Collins and Loveland, Palmer Flowers, you might know, they're organized with a stock option plan that shares ownership. And then just a quick overview here, just on the Colorado scale. There are right now around 150 employee-owned companies, including worker co-ops and ESOPs. And some of these other models that I talked about. And then here are some other names. I think it always helps to see real examples of these when you're trying to envision who you might look to for a model or information going forward. So I will stop for a minute. That's the super quick overview of a few types of employee ownership.
There's a lot of information. I'm sure you could speak an entire session on,
yes.
on just that portion of it. I got a one question for clarification. So you say one employee, one vote. Does that apply to executive management as well?
It does. They happen in connection with each other. So you can have both of those. So co-ops can have executive management and they can have a board, and both are interacting, but it doesn't take the place of that. In a cooperative, all of the people that work there have an equal vote to whoever is in that executive management role. And the management might be dictating certain things more traditionally, like in a company that's not employee owned on the day-to-day basis. But when it comes to those high-level governance decisions, that's the real difference in a co-op, is that everybody who works there who is an owner is allowed to have an equal vote at that scale.
Are you seeing a trend towards more EO businesses and away from private or stockholder ownership?
Yeah, it is definitely growing. As you can see, though, the sector is still small in comparative, to the number of businesses in the U.S. right now. I think one of the biggest reasons for that still is an access to capital, which is kind of a whole other topic, but it's something being discussed right now at the national scale. Like, how do you help grow these types of companies and get the capital in there if it's the employees that are the ones trying to buy the companies? The federal government has tried to start mandating some of these things all the way back to the Main Street Act, really putting their support behind it. But so far, there's still a gap around how the lending and the capital can get into the hands of the people that would like to buy the businesses. So I think that's probably still one of the largest hurdles to growing the sector.
In a worker cooperative, how are people hired or fired?
In a worker co-op, it's fairly similar to hiring employees, right? That you still have to go through the same process as having traditional employees of hiring and firing. But the difference is oftentimes worker co-ops for the hiring side will have what's called a candidacy period, which is where people will be hired on as an employee but not brought on as owners. Because as you can imagine, you wouldn't want to hire somebody and become a co-owner with them right up front. You'd probably like to have some amount of time to say, do I really want to share my company with this person? So co-ops have really a wide variation of candidacy periods, and the business can decide that itself. It could be 6 months, it could be 5 years, whatever feels right. And then people are typically brought through a learning process. They learn about the company, they learn about how to understand its finances, how it operates from that governance level. And then typically there's a vote at the end of whatever that period is, and the current owners of that company will vote whether they want to extend ownership to that new person. And the other person, the worker, decides if they want to buy in. And there's typically some buy-in amount that's decided upon within the company. And then at that point, they become a co-owner and share in the votes from that point forward and in the profits of the company. And then firing, usually laid out in the bylaws. It's not that much different than in traditional companies. Typically it's a vote of the working owners in a similar fashion. They would decide to ask that person to leave, and they would be given their buy-in back. Typically, again, this can be set up differently for different companies, but they might get that buy-in plus any of the profits that they've amassed as a coworker up until that point.
Okay, great. What specific resources are there in Colorado for EO businesses?
We're lucky to have lots of great resources here. We're the Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center. We're a nonprofit. We work statewide, so we have lots of resources that we can talk to you about. And also the state office was funded recently by Governor Polis, who's a big supporter of employee ownership. And so through OEDIT, the department of the state government in Denver, there's a whole employee ownership office, and I have links for those at the end. And they have tremendous resources now. There's a whole EO commission now that's working on behalf of this sector within the state that brings together incredible minds, all trying to help support the sector. There's also the Center for Community Wealth Building, which is in Denver, a nonprofit, especially for startups. I'd recommend reaching out to them. They work with worker-owned cooperative startups and have lots of resources as well.
Great. Maybe we can put those resources up in the links at the for the session on the page. So
Great. We can do that.
I don't have any other questions. I think you can probably
Great.
get
I
into
will
your third
keep
section.
going. Okay, so talk a little bit about how an EO startup or transition works. And it's a little different. So I'll just try to hit the middle here today. So hopefully this will apply to whatever space you're in if you're listening today. The beginning of the process obviously is the exploration phase. As I mentioned earlier, this can vary in the length of time that it takes within different types of companies, and for different reasons that you might be pursuing employee ownership. So exploring all of the types of benefits that I mentioned is a great place to start. There's a lot online about that. You can start, as I mentioned, with the Colorado Employee Ownership Office, reaching out to us. And then, if you start looking nationwide too, there's actually a U.S. Federation of Worker-Owned Cooperatives. There's the NCEO, which is the National Center for Employee Ownership, that can help with ESOPs and other types. And through those, what you'll probably start to find is a lot of examples of other companies, and hopefully that will help start that envisioning of what this might look like. So there's lots to explore to try to figure out what is the right structure, whether you're just starting up or whether you're an owner or an employee within a business. You can start this exploration from whatever perspective you are coming to, because often I'll talk about the owner's perspective in this, but oftentimes we do have employees calling who are starting to think about this and wonder if they might be able to bring the idea into the mix of the place where they work. The second phase is the assessment phase, and this is where we can help the other organizations I mentioned, and this is where you're really starting to look at the details of your company. This would be, for startups, starting to look at how these models might work from the get-go, depending on your size, or possibly how you might build into the core of the structure the pathways that would make that transition even easier and less costly if you wanted to go there, and how you could start bringing people in, especially if it's one of those in-between type models of sharing stock or things like that. All of that you can start to assess. And this is where you'd really start to get into the details of, what size company are we? What model do we want to look at? How many people are we? What industry are we in? And starting to look at, is this viable right now? Might it be more viable later? So at the end of this phase, then you would move into the structure phase. And that's where you've really made the decision. You know what makes the most sense. And typically this is the part where you'd want to connect with lawyers who are knowledgeable about employee ownership, often CPAs, because as you can imagine, how the books are set up differs with different types of employee ownership. So that's the phase where everything is literally put into place. Whether it's a corporation with bylaws, those would be drafted, an operating agreement if it's an LLC. Different types of companies can be employee owned. And we do see that it can be helpful connecting with service providers that understand these models already, so that you're not reinventing the wheel when you're creating those kind of documents. And we're lucky in Colorado to have more and more of those people who are specializing in these specific ownership types. And then we see the execute phase, which is where the actual conversion would happen, or if you're a startup, the actual company would be set up and launched. And then you start to figure out all the details of how do you run a business collectively. We at RMEOC can help with that transition, especially with worker cooperatives. As you can imagine, figuring out how people can operate effectively and efficiently and compete against other companies. If there's, say, 8 people making every decision on a governance level rather than 1 or 2, it is different, but there are really, really great ways and structures for communication and decision making that can allow businesses to remain competitive. And all the way back to those stats I talked about at the beginning, we really do see when co-ops and all types of employee ownership can work on those structures and find a place to operate effectively together, they can actually outperform other types of businesses. And then once that transition happens, hopefully those structures are coming into place, and then you move into more of a support phase. And that's also where groups like ours, the Colorado State Office, the national groups like the Federation of Co-ops, NCO, all those groups have ongoing programs, webinars, conferences, all types of things to support you when you're in this structure and in the sector of employee ownership. So that's a really great piece of going down this path, I would say, too, is that once you are a part of the sector, because it is smaller, there's just a nice subsector of businesses for you to connect to, and people tend to be very supportive of each other because you have this tie and this bond. We're starting to see some great peer networks manifest in Colorado, one specifically for ESOPs, another for worker co-ops, and businesses are coming together for happy hours and different breakfast meetups specifically to share ideas and support each other as they move forward. So it's not only support within the sector itself between businesses, but there's all of us here within the state and nationally who are here then to help once you actually convert or set up as an employee-owned business. And then some readiness factors to think about. This is mostly towards conversions again, but I did put in some thoughts here for startups. So I think a lot of them would apply in the way, again, that you might just be thinking about these things in the future. So financial health, profits, obviously, if you're going to convert the business, that's pretty key that the business is on a good path for the employees to take over. A committed selling owner. And in this case, as a startup, being committed to that path can just, again, help define the decisions you're going to make throughout all of the startup so that you're on this path, even if you don't start there. Committed and experienced employees, in any case, obviously that's very key, but remember that it's often kind of the chicken and the egg. By turning into an employee-owned company or starting up as one, you tend to engage employees in that way. And they do become more committed and experienced because they engage with more within the company operations. And then a proven business track record, if it's in conversion, that can help. So some more sort of sub-thoughts, which I won't go fully into, but specifically for startups, do you have a core group of 3 or more? That's the easiest way to start up a co-op. Again, ESOPs would be bigger, kind of more down the road. If you are smaller than 3, as I mentioned, there are ways to bring different types of businesses together. So you could still continue that exploration and see how that might be able to manifest. If you're already in business, is the business growing? What does that look like if the employees are going to consider taking over the business? Trust, obviously a huge word in this whole arrangement between employees and owners, and that can really start right from the beginning of working with anyone you're going to start up a business with. And looking at how you're going to share information, that's something you can build in at the beginning. That can lead to a really healthy environment for a later conversion. And then incentives tied to performance. How is it going to look where if an employee contributes to the overall success, how are they going to be connected to the profits and the success of the business? One quick note I wanted to throw in here specifically for startups. I'm sure many of you have heard of this if you are pursuing a startup. There's a thing called the business model canvas, which is a way to vision for business planning. And it can often take the place or be a starting point anyway for a larger business plan. And I just wanted to note this specifically here as a tool that can really lend itself to working collectively, because it's a very visual way to envision how a business will start up. This is often a poster. You can either do it digitally or literally on the wall with sticky notes. And in those sorts of times, it's really great if you have multiple people all want to contribute ideas as opposed to sitting down and having to write a traditional business plan. Check this out. There's a lot online. There's some books that go into it. And companies of all types use this. It's not specifically for employee-owned businesses, but I just think it's specifically a really neat tool that has this collective leaning because it's visual, it's quick, it's designed to be populated with lots of smaller ideas that pool together to form basically the way your business is going to make money. So here's just a kind of summary of what I've been talking about in terms of the support for the whole transition to this concept, whether you're just starting out and switching your mindset to this, or you're literally switching a business. We're here to help, and there's other entities here to help doing all these things. So we can help you source solutions, help you explore the different models, help implement it, and then help get that education that I was talking about. So here are a few resources. Colorado Employee Ownership Office, the U.S. Federation I already mentioned, the National Center on Employee Ownership. There's also the Democracy at Work Institute. I'd recommend looking them up. They have a ton of resources. They're doing a lot of advocacy for the whole sector across the country. And also the Workers to Owners Collaborative, the website Becoming Employee Owned. They actually have a whole section of case studies, which I think can be really helpful. You can break it down by either the geographic region or by sector type and try to see some companies that might be in the sector that you are in and read about how they became employee owned. The other ones I've mentioned, so they will be here as resources. And that's it for my full content. I'd love to switch to any questions. And just thanks again for listening, everyone.
Great, thank you, Ashley. One question, where can we find the vision template that you shared a few slides back?
The business model, the canvas?
Yeah, if you go back like 2 or 3 slides,
yeah,
I think.
This one?
Right there. Yeah.
It is open source online. So if you just do a web search for the business model canvas, I've found PDFs that you can download. As I mentioned, I've even used ones where we've blown it up to a big poster size where we've wanted to do visioning for employee-owned businesses from the beginning. And you can put those up on the wall, read a little bit about these different, they call them the building blocks. So there's 9 building blocks, and what you do is go through collectively to brainstorm everything you can think about of what would your customer segment be. Or one of their unique pieces is called a value proposition. What value are you going to bring to your customers? There's actually a whole sub book about that. So there's a book about the business model canvas, but a whole thing that dives into value propositions. And then you can see you go into everything else here. Where do you think the money is going to come from? And they recommend brainstorming with sticky notes, as I mentioned, because it's meant to be a very light and quick way to envision and be able to change ideas over time. So as you can see, it's just a nice way, if you picture a group, say, of 6 people starting up a business together, to be able to do that over time. You can leave it up, you can change the ideas as things iterate. Also, larger companies, I think it was the iPod actually for Apple, they have an example where they use this. So you can use it later on just to set up ideas for new products and how the revenue is going to come in for that product and how you'll specifically tap into a segment of your customer base. So it really just has lots of applicability. It's a neat model. But again, It's nice. There's tons online that's open and free to download.
Great. Janine is asking if she can get a copy of your slide deck. Would you be willing to make that available?
Sure. Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Great. In terms of setting up a new company, does deciding to go in the EO direction have any impact on the type of business that is looking to be set up? So like an LLC versus an S Corp, or are those an EO, like, is that another option, or can you talk a little bit about how those would work together?
Yeah, there's really, I wouldn't call it an impact. There's it will look different, which is why I was recommending trying to find legal experts or CPAs that have that knowledge built in, because there are aspects of the bylaws that the statutes dictate need to be there, kind of like the guardrails that make it different than, say, starting up an LLC. There will be things built into those structures if you decide to set up that way. For the in-between models and ESOPs, it's a little bit different because it's not built into the very core of the company, but those things would get written into whatever agreements there are around profit sharing, et cetera. So again, still nice if you can find someone to help you do that, but lots of people could probably research that. And we are finding more and more service providers who are interested in it and hearing about it and wanting to learn. So even by just going down that path and asking, they might be able to tap into the resources now as it's growing, especially in the state of Colorado, where people can adapt those pieces. But it can be an LLC, it can be a corporation. Everything can basically be applied. It does take that shift, that difference to put up those pieces that make it uniquely employee owned.
Great. I think this is a really great question. If I have a startup, what are some actual first steps I can take to start as an EO company?
As a startup, yeah. I'd say it's, it really starting at that first bubble that I pointed out, exploring, try to find examples that are similar, so that you can look to those for inspiration. Reaching out to all the groups that I mentioned, almost all of them have startup resources. And more, I just recently talked to someone at the Denver Public Library, and they have a whole realm of business support there, and they're starting to learn more about employee ownership so that when you go in there, they can help you do research around these types of companies. So in a lot of ways, for a startup, you would go down exactly the same path as any startup, because at the end of the day, a business that's employee owned has to be a business and has to be successful. So these things get put into the mix along with the traditional path to employee ownership. So first and foremost, going down the road of making sure, like using the business model canvas, those types of tools, knowing that the business can be successful, and then looking to these resources either statewide or nationally to figure out how the specifics need to be set up for whatever type you choose or whatever type you might want to reach later down the road. Say if you're starting up, but 5 to 10 years out, you want to switch to this, you can start to find that information to build it in to the core of that business.
Yeah, I think one thing that, and with the startup companies, funding is, and having enough resources is always a challenge. And so you certainly have a lot of information about this. And the organization that you work for, the Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center, how does that organization help convert a company to an EO? Are you guys funded by the state? Are you funded by the company you're doing that? Like how does that work, just as we're trying to plan for what type of cost might be involved in this?
Yeah. So I guess to answer the first part, we are funded not only in partnership with some state funding, but also by nonprofit funders, grant funding. So we can work a lot of times without having to charge clients. We do a lot of introductory work and a lot of ongoing support and things. If we do engage more deeply with a client to go down a worker cooperative path, then we do have a small technical advising contract that typically spans about a year, as I mentioned, walking through the company, with the company through that whole process. And then, yeah, it is the part of the startup challenge, right? Where does that funding come from? It's a challenge for EO companies or other ones. For conversions, I think in the slides I mentioned some ballpark planning. For startups, I don't think you'd have to plan for much different. Again, if you're already decided on that path, you'll be going down a very similar path So there's not much of a difference there, but the conversions are where the costs come in, where some planning has to happen. And oftentimes there is, in a conversion situation, the selling owners are willing to finance some of that cost for the employees and get paid back over time for the value of the company. And then we oftentimes also look to some national lenders who specifically will support employee ownership, and through a merger of those two sources, the employees can get enough funding to buy the business and then pay that off over time. So a lot of times those costs for the conversion get lumped into that larger sale and paid off slowly.
Great. Thank you so much for your time today and for sharing this information about employee ownership. I know that it's not something that probably comes to the forefront of one's mind when they're starting a company, but I think this is very helpful today. So thank you so much for doing that. This actually wraps up our sessions for today, so the end of day 2. Looking forward into day 3 tomorrow. The theme tomorrow is going to be Reimagine, and there's several panels and sessions on DEI, the heart of leadership, and the Great Resignation. So that sounds like a great lineup tomorrow. Again, a reminder this afternoon, I've said this the last couple of sessions, one of the best things about Longmont Startup Week is meeting other people in the community. And so there's 2 happy hours that start in about an hour at 4 o'clock and go until 7. There's the Roost, and then also the Gross and Bart Brewery. So I think I'm going to probably head over to the Roost and grab a little bit of lunch because I haven't had that yet, but then I'll probably see you at the happy hour if you'll go there. Again, thank you so much for attending today, and I'm looking forward to your participation tomorrow. As I do wrap up, I do want to thank our sponsors, because without our sponsors, Longmont Startup Week would not be what it is. So thank you to the ARC Thrift Stores, Avocet Communications, Ward Electric Company, and the Longmont Economic Development Partnership as our platinum sponsors. For our gold sponsors, we have Biz West, Left Hand Brewery, and Docketly. The connected sponsors are Downtown Longmont and High Plains Bank. And then also we have some in-kind sponsors. And if you go out to the networking events, you'll see Handprint Inc., Circle Graphics, Sticker Giant, and Chop 5. And I know that Sticker Giant has provided some really fun stickers this year that you can pick up at the networking events and the happy hours. So thank you so much, and hopefully we'll see you in the happy hours.